People love to make predictions about the future, right? Like one of the most popular things in our culture right now is like sports betting, because people love to make predictions about the future. But when people make predictions about the future, they often make them really vague because they know nobody knows what's going to happen, right? And so, if you're watching the weather in the winter and the weatherman comes on, he's like, tomorrow there's a 33% chance of 0 to 6 inches of snow. And then you're like, dude, you left yourself a lot of wiggle room there, right? And then you wake up the next morning, there's like a foot of snow on the ground. You're like, you were still wrong. How did you do that? Or a couple years ago, I was at a Chinese food restaurant, and I got a fortune cookie. And I opened it, and it was like, you are about to meet someone new. Or someone new is about to come into your life. And so the whole next day, I was wondering, like, was that the new cashier at King Soopers, right? We all have these times where people like to make predictions about the future. And we're always wrong, usually wrong, because, we're just humans. Humans don't know the future. And we usually leave things very vague if we do try to predict it, so we're less likely to be wrong. But we don't actually know what it's about to come. So what if I could tell you today, what if I could show you today a part of Scripture that predicted things about the future? And it didn't just predict vague things like 0 to 6 inches of snow. No. And it didn't just predict things that were going to take place tomorrow, like your horoscope. You're going to have a great day, right? But it was very specific. And it was predictions that took 1,000 years to take place. How would that change your faith? If you could see that this morning in this book of Daniel, how would that change your faith? Would it give you more confidence in the Lord and His Word? The book of Daniel, we've been in it for some weeks now, and it can be clearly divided into two halves. There's the first half, all these stories in Daniel's life that we've been going through in chapters 1 through 6. There's some of the stories Daniel in the lion's den, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. These amazing stories, real life stories about Daniel's life. That's the whole first half of the book. And then you get to the second half of the book, chapters 7 to 12, and you come to prophecy. If you are reading through Scripture, like you've done like a read through Scripture in a year, and you get to Daniel in the first half, you're like, oh yeah, I've known these stories. And then you get to the second half, and you're like, wait, did I flip to Revelation? What in the world is going on? Because it becomes prophecy. It becomes the second half, chapters 7 to 12, becomes predictions about the future. What God is going to do is He's giving Daniel at different points in his life these dreams and these visions. And God uses things like images of an animal or images of a beast, like a fantastical beast, something you would see in Harry Potter or something, like not even a real animal. Or God gives them these dreams, and they're all symbolic of things that are going to take place in the future. And actually, it's not even just the second half of the book. In chapter 2, I don't know if you remember this, it's been a few weeks, right? But we read a dream that God gave Nebuchadnezzar. And it's the same idea. It was a dream, a vision of the future. So you get to this part of the book, this whole second half, and it's all these dreams and visions and prophecies, predictions about the future that Daniel is given by God. And some of them, just a few of them, are about the end times, like stuff that even in our life hasn't happened yet. A few of them. We're not going to touch on those a lot today. A few of them are about the Messiah that from Daniel's perspective, writing in the 500s BC, has still not come and is hundreds of years in the future. We're going to talk about those next week. Instead, most of the second half of this book of Daniel is all predictions about what was about to take place over the next 1,000 years of world history. So the rise and fall of empires, right? That stuff you slept through in world history class. That stuff. So these chapters, they're incredibly complex. And, when you hear this, though, that, okay, Daniel, he's writing these prophecies about what's going to take place in his, 1,000 years after his life. And, well, that means these have been done for like 1,500 years. I must not have anything to learn from them. Can we go eat tacos? Not yet, okay? Because actually you do have something to learn from these. Because I have one and only one goal for this morning. That you would leave this place more confident in God and His Word than when you walked in. That's all I want out of this morning. That's what I want you to get. That's what I want you to get. These chapters of prophecy, they're incredibly complex. I mean, God is using images of beasts and all statue, all this stuff to tell you about what's going to happen in world history. They're incredibly complex. Actually, if you read through these chapters, Daniel himself will tell you that he's confused at some of the points. Sometimes when he's getting these dreams, he's like, I'm exhausted. It's just so overwhelming. And he says that he even needed to ask God to help him interpret what they meant. You might feel like that while we're going through it a little bit too. So that's okay, because Daniel did. I know I did when I was going through this, studying to be able to teach this message. It took me about 3 times what a normal message takes to prepare, just because it's so complex and you cover so much ground. And it is not a normal message. Because if we're going to be looking at 1,000 years of predictions that Daniel made, we want to know, did he get them right? And if you're going to do that, it means that you're going to need to track through 1,000 years of world history. Now, I used to teach world history. It took me a semester to make it through 1,000 years. We're going to do it in 20 minutes, okay? So you're going to have to stick with me. It's not a normal message at all. I've never given a message like this, so if this is one of your first times with us at Mission Lakewood, I would ask you very kindly come back next week when I return to my regularly scheduled sermons, okay? This is not a normal sermon. It's a bit of a class. I want you to see what happened and whether Daniel was right or whether he was wrong as he predicted all of this about history. So what he's going to do is that over the course of 5 chapters, Daniel is going to walk through 6 different empires. So if you remember back to world history, there are these different empires that rose and fall, right? They rise and they fall through history. They come to power and they fall away. And Daniel's going to be telling us about these different empires through these images and visions of these beasts and this statue. And he's predicting 1,000 years of world history. And the crazy thing is that when Daniel was given these visions, none of it had happened yet. But now that we're living a few thousand years after him, we can look back and go, did it happen? Unlike a fortune cookie, you can actually test these predictions of the future now that we're on the other side of them. So instead of taking one chapter at a time today, we're going to go chronologically through the prophecies of each of these 6 empires and what happened after Daniel's life. Because they're not given sequentially. Daniel actually goes through different cycles of images. So instead of confusing the heck out of you, I'm just going to give it to you chronologically, each empire at a time. You are going to need to put on your thinking cap. If you need to get coffee, go do it now, because you better stay awake. It's going to be good. It's going to be good. But if you'll engage with this, you will walk out of this room this morning more confident in the Lord and his word than when you walked in. So let us fly back to the 6th century BC. So 500s BC, when Daniel was receiving these dreams, these visions from God, and he wrote them down about the future rise and fall of world empires over the next 1,000 years. And let's ask if he got them right. So the first empire we see actually in this span of 1,000 years is the Babylonian Empire. And actually, this was the one that was in power when we were reading a lot of these stories of Daniel's life. Remember King Nebuchadnezzar? He was the king of Babylon. So he's the first of these empires. And in chapter 2, when King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon had a dream of a statue, Daniel helped him interpret it. And he told Nebuchadnezzar in 2 verse 38, "You are that head of gold." In chapter 7, Babylonian Empire is described as being like a lion. It had the wings of an eagle. But then Daniel gives a very specific prediction and says that to Nebuchadnezzar that the Babylonian Empire will, in chapter 2, verse 35, be swept away without leaving a trace. Now that's an interesting prediction. We have a lot of traces of almost every major empire in world history. So did it take place? Well, yeah. In 539 BC, the Medo-Persian Empire actually came into Babylon and destroyed it. They took over Babylon. And one of the interesting things from an archaeological standpoint is that we can't find almost anything from the Babylonian, just a few things from the Babylonian Empire. Things like the Hanging Gardens, if you've studied the ancient wonders of the world. There's no trace of them. They were from Babylon. And so it came true. They really were swept away without leaving a trace. So his predictions that he received from God about this first empire of Babylon came true. Next, Daniel's prophecies, they turned to another kingdom, The kingdom that defeated Babylon, the Medo-Persian Empire. In the dream of the statue in chapter 2, the Medo-Persian Empire was described as the chest and arms of silver. That's Daniel 2:32. Why silver? Well, hadn't happened yet, but a few decades after his time, this empire rose to prominence, and they held their royal treasury in silver. Their soldiers, we know, fought with silver-tipped spears. Their capital was covered in walls and columns and ceilings of silver. And so that actually took place. Then in the dream of the beasts in chapter 7, when it's describing this kingdom of Babylon, the second kingdom was described as, in verse 5, a bear. It was raised up on one of its sides. It's also then described as a ram in chapter 8, where it says, the two-horned ram that you saw represents the kings of Media and Persia. Verse 3, before me was a ram with two horns. So remember, Daniel's actually seeing in front of his eyes this vision that God's giving him, right? Before me was a ram with two horns standing beside the canal, and the horns were long. One of the horns was longer than the other, but grew up later. So he describes it like a bear with one side stronger than the other. And he describes it like this ram, right? The Medes and Persians, as you can probably figure out by the name if you don't remember from high school world history, were a kingdom actually of two sides, the Medes and the Persians. I bet you could have figured that out, right? And the Medes were the older, weaker side. The Persians were the newer, stronger side. And so if you actually look at what Daniel was saying in these two horns where one's longer, one's shorter, this takes place. And we're given one more detail about the vision of this bear, this kingdom of the Medes and the Persians. And verse 5 of chapter 7, it says it had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. And by 3 ribs, it's talking about this prophecy where the Medo-Persians would actually take over 3 different, they would devour 3 kingdoms. And that's actually what happened decades after Daniel's time. They took over the Babylonians, the Lydians, and the Egyptian kingdoms. The final of these happened in 525 BC when the Persians defeated the Egyptians. Now, before you get lost in the history and the timeline, remember, Daniel is writing before any of this happens. And he's guessing it, not guessing it, he's predicting it from God truly. It all took place. Next, the prophecies then turn to the Greek Empire. The Greek Empire. Now, do you remember Alexander the Great from world history class? Or if you were skipping it, maybe the bit of a bomb of a movie in the early 2000s by Colin Farrell and Angelina Jolie. Okay? Nobody saw it. It's okay if you didn't. Okay? But you remember Alexander the Great. Well, actually, Alexander the Great lived a couple hundred years after Daniel, and yet Daniel knew a crazy amount of information about him. Here's how Daniel describes Alexander in Daniel 10:3-4. He was a mighty king. A mighty king will arise who will rule with great power. 8:21. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece. Remember, God's using these images of different animals to describe different kings and empires. So how would you like to be known as a shaggy goat? Not just a goat, a shaggy goat. The shaggy goat is the king of Greece, and the large horn between its eyes is the first king. Daniel 8:7, I saw it attack. So I saw this goat attack the ram furiously, striking the ram and shattering its horns. So the ram was the Medo-Persian Empire. I know this can get confusing. I know it feels like Revelation. The ram was the Medo-Persian Empire. And so did this happen, that the Greek Empire defeated them? Well, yeah. Hundreds of years after Daniel's life, Alexander the Great defeated the Persians in 331 BC. He predicted it correctly. Then he goes on to say in Daniel 8:5, a goat with a prominent horn between its eyes came from the west, crossing the whole earth without touching the ground. So this is the Greek Empire, and the horn is Alexander the Great, and the idea is that it's moving quickly. And from history, we know Alexander conquered the entire known world in 10 years. And I struggle to get out of bed sometimes in the morning, right? 10 years, conquered the whole known world that quickly. So that was true too. Daniel 8:8, the goat became very great, but at the height of its power, the large horn was broken off. But remember, we just said the horn was Alexander the Great. And actually, this took place in history. We know that Alexander the Great died. He died at only the age of 32 in the year 323 BC. So Daniel gets this prediction right hundreds of years before it happens. Then he says in Daniel 10:4, after he has risen, so after Alexander the Great has conquered, his empire will be broken up and parceled out to the four winds of heaven. It will not go to his descendants, nor will it have the power he exercised, because his power will be uprooted and given to others. Now, I know some of the language there is confusing, but it's actually a very specific prophecy. He says his power will not go to his descendants. Well, guess what? A couple hundred years later, Alexander the Great had no descendants. He had no children. It says that it will be divided into four. Well, we know that by the year 321, what had been the Greek kingdom of Alexander was divided into four different kingdoms: the Ptolemies, the Seleucids, the Pergamums, and the Macedonians. There'll be a test later, and you have to say all those names correctly, okay? This prophecy of the Greek kingdom being split into four, that's really specific. And Daniel made it 200 years before it happened. 200 years. And it gets repeated again in chapter 7. And then chapter 8, it says the four horns, this is verse 22, the four horns that replace the one that was broken off represent four kingdoms that will emerge from his nation, but will not have the same power. And that too came true. These four kingdoms were never anywhere close as powerful as Alexander in their reach. So Daniel's prophecy about the future of this Greek empire that all took place 200 years after Daniel's life, it happened. Historical fact. Next, Daniel turns to the Ptolemaic and Seleucid empires, and he starts like this in Daniel 11:5. The king of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. He's not purposely trying to confuse you. Like if you wrote a letter, don't write this to people. But he says the kingdom of the south will become strong, but one of his commanders will become even stronger than he and will rule his own kingdom with great power. So here's what he's saying. This really happened. After Alexander the Great's death, two of his commanders in particular fought each other. So you had Ptolemy, he was one of the commanders, and he created the kingdom in the south, the Ptolemaic kingdom. And then Alexander's, one of his bodyguards, his main commanders, Seleucus, he created the Seleucid Empire of the north. So by 312 BC, the Seleucid and Ptolemaic empires had been formed. And as verse 5 accurately predicts, the Seleucid kingdom would be more powerful. Again, all of this is taking place hundreds of years after Daniel's time, and he got it right. This kingdom would be more powerful than the other. And as you keep reading in chapter 11, there's this succession of dozens of crazy specific predictions about marriages and army maneuvers and all this stuff that he gets right as well. And then we meet the next important king of the Seleucid Empire, Antiochus Epiphanes. And if you've heard anything about the prophecies in Daniel, you might have heard this verse. It says this about Antiochus, Daniel 11:31. His armed forces will rise up to desecrate the temple fortress and will abolish the daily sacrifice. Then they will set up the abomination that causes desolation. He terribly persecuted God's people. So, is this what happened? Did this king actually do this? Well, yes, he did. Antiochus led his army to capture Jerusalem in the year 167 BC. Antiochus went into the temple and he desecrated it. So if you know anything about the temple in Jerusalem, it was the holiest place where you did sacrifices. And this foreign king, he goes into the temple and he actually sacrifices a pig, an unclean animal, to a false god, Zeus, in the temple, desecrating it. This is what Daniel's talking about. This same prophecy is repeated in chapter 8, and Antiochus Epiphanes did really indeed persecute terribly the Jewish people hundreds of years after Daniel's time. And historically, we know that he didn't allow them to come to the temple and make the sacrifices that the Jewish people were used to making there. And get this, Daniel actually knew how long this persecution of Antiochus over the Jewish people would take. Because he knew how long that they were not going to be able to use the temple. So writing a couple hundred years before it happened, Daniel in 8:14 said, "It will take 2,300 evenings and mornings, then the sanctuary will be reconsecrated." Now, that is a prediction of 6 1/3 years. Daniel wrote this, again, hundreds of years before it happened. So did it happen? Well, yes. Antiochus persecuted the Jews from about September 171 BC to December 165 BC when he died. That's exactly 6 1/3 years. This is no horoscope prediction of you're going to have a good day tomorrow, right? This is precise. It's specific. And he knew it. He knew it. Next, Daniel turns to the greatest empire, maybe in world history, but the greatest empire in this timeline, this 1,000 years run, the Roman Empire. Daniel says this in 7:7. "After that, in my vision at night, I looked, and there before me was a fourth beast, terrifying and frightening and very powerful. It had large iron teeth. It crushed and devoured its victims and trampled underfoot whatever was left. It was different from all the former beasts, and it had 10 horns." Now, did this happen? Did the most powerful of these kingdoms in this 1,000-year run come after these 4 kingdoms? Well, yes. Rome defeated the final of the 4 kingdoms that followed Alexander the Great. They defeated, in 30 BC, they defeated the Ptolemies in Egypt. And the prophecy was spot on. If you track through world history, you'll find that Rome, over all these other empires that are mentioned in Daniel, had more power and land than any of them. They devoured, they trampled their enemies and all these other nations. Then the Roman Empire reached its height. It reached its peak of power in 117 AD under Emperor Trajan. The number 10, as in the 10 horns mentioned in verse 7, it symbolizes completion. And in a profound sense, Rome was so powerful that their power was complete. It was absolute, as Daniel describes. Now remember, Daniel is writing 600 years before this happens at this point. 600 years before this happened. And there's more. In the dream of the statue in chapter 2, Rome is described as 2 feet. And so in chapter 2, the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, each body part of the statue in the dream of Nebuchadnezzar represents one of these different empires. And finally, you get to the feet, which was Rome. And it says this in verse 41. "Just as you saw that the feet and toes were partly of baked clay and partly of iron, so this will be a divided kingdom." Meaning, this kingdom is going to eventually be divided in 2. Now, did this historically happen? Well, yeah, the Roman Empire, this is one of the biggest events in world history. The Roman Empire split into 2 in 286 AD into the western and the eastern halves. They actually had their own emperors, right? So this happened. It came to pass. And Daniel even predicted the fall of Rome, one of the biggest events in world history. Daniel 7:11, "I kept looking until the beast was slain and its body destroyed and thrown into the blazing fire. The other beasts had been stripped of their authority, but were allowed to live for a period of time." Now, did this come true? Yeah. This is very interesting historically. All the other kingdoms, as the next kingdom conquered them, Babylon, Persia, the Greeks, well, they were allowed to stay on as just one little province of the next empire. But the Roman Empire was totally different. Because if you study world history, you'll find that the Germanic tribes came in and they destroyed Rome, and it just fell to pieces. There was nothing left. It was done. It was done. It was destroyed, just as the verse tells us. So Daniel's prophecy about the future of the Roman Empire all came true. So at this point, as you're tracking through, Daniel's giving these crazy images of these goats and rams and beasts and all this stuff, and it's mind-blowing, right? And we've tracked through 5 different of these kingdoms, these empires. But now when we get to the 6th empire, things are a little different. Because this is a different sort of kingdom. This is Jesus' kingdom. Daniel 7:18, it says, "The holy people of the Most High will receive the kingdom." Verse 14, "His dominion," so the king of this kingdom, the last kingdom, "his dominion is an everlasting dominion that will not pass away, and his kingdom is one that will never be destroyed." Daniel 7 actually calls this Messiah that is coming for this last kingdom the Son of Man. If you study the Gospels, you know that Jesus usually referred to himself as the Son of Man. In Daniel 9, Daniel calls the Messiah the Anointed One. Do you know what the word Christ means? It means the Anointed One. Remember the terrible beast with the horns from chapter 7, the Roman Empire? Here's what it says about the Roman Empire and this new kingdom in verses 21 to 22. As I watched, this horn was waging war against the holy people. So this is the Roman Empire waging war against Jesus' people and defeating them. So the Ancient of Days came and pronounced judgment in favor of the holy people of the Most High, and the time came when they possessed the kingdom. So this is interesting. It's actually predicting that the Roman Empire would persecute the followers of the Messiah, but then that they would come to possess that kingdom. That's pretty specific too. Now, did that happen? Yes, it absolutely did. For years after Jesus' death and resurrection, the Christians were persecuted, put to death, executed for their faith. And yet, the church grew and grew and grew throughout the Roman Empire. And it grew so quickly that by 313 AD, Christianity actually became the official religion in the Roman Empire. So while it was persecuted at first, eventually it came to possess the kingdom, just as Daniel said. And then, and this is the craziest prediction of them all. So if I've lost you, which I totally get this morning, if I've lost you in this 1,000 years of history, pay attention to this one. Daniel actually correctly predicted when Jesus would die. Like what year? What year? It says this, Daniel 9:25. From the time the word goes out to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the anointed one, the ruler, comes, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So 7 7-year periods plus 62 more 7-year periods on the lunar calendar is 490 years. And Daniel says at the end of this period, the Messiah would die. Daniel 9:26. After the 62 sevens, the anointed one will be put to death. Okay, I don't like math either, okay? When I was preparing this, the whole time I was like, should I just call Jason and he can figure this part out? But stick with me. The book of Ezra tells us that in 457 BC, the Persian king Artaxerxes issued this decree to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. So in verse 25, when Daniel is predicting this, in verse 25, he says, the time the word goes out to restore the Jerusalem, that's the year he's talking about, 457. So if you start in 457 BC and work forward to 490 years, so if you start when the temple was declared to be restored, Jerusalem was declared to be restored, 457, and you work forward 490 years, my calculator tells me that is 33 AD. Right? So Daniel's actually predicting that the Messiah would come and die in 33 AD. And if that doesn't make the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, I don't know what will. So Daniel, writing hundreds of years earlier, knew that the Messiah, the anointed one, the Savior, would die in the year 33 AD. Okay. History lesson's over. Thank you for sticking with me. Good job. I hope you had enough coffee. But here's the payoff. So look at this timeline now, right? Look how much Daniel knew before it happened. These are very specific things. Who would defeat who? When it would happen. How it would happen. How kingdoms would be divided. Who would die. When the temple would get desecrated. Like, these are very specific. When it came to Jesus, even the exact year. This is not a vague prediction like calling in to the Miss Cleo hotline and they tell you that you have a message from a dead relative whose name starts with the letter D or maybe M, right? Like, this is really specific stuff. Really specific. And it's given hundreds of years before. It's not like an untestable, horoscope prediction that's like, you're going to have a good day tomorrow. Oh, and you're really awesome, right? No. Like, this is absolutely incredible stuff. The book of Daniel made specific, testable predictions about the future. You can put the major timeline of world history for 1,000 years after Daniel's time up because he knew it. He knew it. He knew it. And since by now, all of this has taken place, we can look back in history. We can look back and know that it was all accurate, right? The book of Daniel says it was written, you're going to be real shocked, by Daniel, which means that it was written, I think, between about 539 and 530 BC, meaning Daniel was able to accurately describe specific details about every single major kingdom that would come, the rise and fall of all the world's empires for 1,000 years after his life. So, let me ask you, how in the world did the guy know that? Right? Because we can't tell history. I can't tell you what's going to happen tomorrow, right? You can't tell me. We don't know the future. And I get it. Maybe you're skeptical, okay? So maybe you're skeptical. I'm naturally a skeptical person. So if you're a skeptical person and you're wondering about faith in that thing, maybe you might go, oh, well, maybe the book was actually written after all of this. Maybe the book was actually written like 500 AD, and that's how it knew history. It was all history by that point. It wasn't predicting the future at all. But there's a problem with that. You see, a copy of the book of Daniel was found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. This is a picture of it. And the Dead Sea Scrolls are dated to about 164 BC, right? So we have concrete evidence. We have concrete evidence it was at least written by then. So even if you're the most absolute, even if you're just the most absolute Bible-hating, terrible skeptic, and I get it because I'm a skeptical person too, but maybe if you're just like the most skeptical person, you're thinking maybe Daniel didn't write this, maybe it was written after all of it happened, you actually can't believe that rationally because we have a copy of this book of Daniel that is no later than 164 BC. Now, obviously, I believe the book of Daniel was written by Daniel himself in the 500s BC. I do. But even if you're trying to be as skeptical as possible, you have to admit that somehow this book, knew hundreds of years of world history before it happened. Hundreds of years of world history before it happened. So let me ask you, how could it know that? How could it know that? I think the only reasonable assumption is this. God is real, the Bible is word, and Jesus is his son. Only God can know the future. I don't know the future, right? I have a whole schedule for next week. It's not all going to happen, right? Have you noticed that? Go look at your schedule from last week. You will laugh at it. Nothing happens how you think it's going to happen. You can't predict the future. Only God can. So if Daniel could predict 1,000 years of world history before it happened, down to tiny little details, it has to mean that God was involved. God must be real. And if all of that was placed into God's holy word, into Scripture, it's got to tell us that the Bible is his word. And if he made these predictions about Jesus that took place, well, it's got to mean that Jesus is his son. It's just this unavoidable thing. God is real, the Bible is his word, and Jesus is his son. No human knows the future. Vegas doesn't. The weatherman in Colorado absolutely don't, right? They pay people millions of dollars to guess who's going to win football games. They've got no idea, unless they're betting on the Chiefs, and then they get it right every time, okay? Nobody knows the future. Nobody knows the future. No human knows the future. Only God does. So what does it tell us that Daniel knew 1,000 years of the future? 1,000 years. What does it tell us? Imagine with me for a moment this. Imagine somebody walked through those back doors, right? And the guy just walks up here, and he's got a notebook, and he's got like 10 pages, all these chapters, and he starts telling you what he thinks is going to happen over the next 1,000 years. Most of us would think he was kind of kooky, right? And we'd probably go eat tacos, okay? And what if you got a hold of those notes, and then as you got older, technology developed, and they did that cryogenic brain freeze thing? And as I say this out loud in front of people, I'm realizing I'm watching too much sci-fi on Netflix, right? All right, so they freeze your brain, and then they wake you up in like 1,000 years. And it's the year 3023. You wake up and you're watching the History Channel and you're comparing notes and you're like, oh my goodness, everything was right. You're like, every single detail that guy said in church 1,000 years ago was right? Okay, if that happened, what would be your only rational opinion to hold? That somehow God sent that dude, right? That is what happened in the book of Daniel. We're standing on the other side of it. He made 1,000 years of predictions, detailed predictions, dozens of them, not vague. And he got every single one of them right. Every single one of them right. Because God is real, the Bible is his word, and Jesus is his son. And so if you're someone who you're far from faith, or you're trying to figure out faith, and you're not quite sure if God is real, I would just ask you, how in the world did Daniel get this right if God isn't real? Seriously, try to guess what will happen tomorrow. Tell me how it goes. How did he get it real if God's not real? How did he get it right if God's not real? So if you are that person who's skeptical, if you're trying to figure out faith, I get it. But some of this is unavoidable. God's real. God's real. And here's the thing. If Daniel was right about all these predictions, about these empires, and how they'd rise and they'd fall, and who would kill who, and who would take over, if he was right about all that, and then he gets to the part about the Messiah, don't you figure he's right about the Messiah too? And so if you are far from faith, try to figure it out, I would just say, pay attention to this. Because God is real. God is real. The Bible is his word, and Jesus is his son. And if you are a person who believes in Jesus and follows him, man, I know that there are just times that doubt creeps into your mind. And you're like, I believe, Jesus, help me believe, right? Have you prayed that prayer? And there's that little doubt in the back of your mind. Okay, is this real? Is this real? And in those moments, when you hear that quiet little voice of doubt, remind yourself of things like this. That somehow Daniel was able to predict 1,000 years of world history, down to every little tiny detail. And if that's the case, God must be real. And let yourself walk out this morning with more confidence in the Lord than when you walked in.